I'm David Beckmann. Over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be teaching a lifelong learning class at Virginia Theological Seminary. I'm really looking forward to it. These are experienced people, and I expect to learn a lot. And then I'll also be posting every week a short video introducing the topic for that week, and I'll post that video also on social media. If that's the way you see these videos, I hope you too will find them helpful. In this first video, I want to share 3 insights that I think are foundational. First, that God's made it possible in our time to make dramatic progress against poverty. You know, it's not good enough anymore to it's important to help families one by one, to maintain food banks and that sort of thing. But God's made it possible for us to do much more. And then the second insight is that that people in this country, certainly people of faith, can make big impacts on the politics of poverty and really move forward the process that God surely wants. And then the third insight is that we are now at a really decisive time, a pivotal time for our nation and the world. We're needed now. So to start, I want to show my favorite graphic. You can see on the right the dramatic reduction in extreme poverty in the world over the last 30 years. In 1990, more than a third of the people in the world were living in absolute poverty. By 2019, it was down to about 10%. It goes from 2 billion extremely poor people in 1990 to maybe 600 million in 2019. I think this is an experience of our loving God moving in our history. Since then, of course, the pandemic has been a setback. The World Bank estimates that another 100 million people have been driven back into poverty. And now I think the war in Ukraine is disrupting the economic growth everywhere, disrupting the world, disrupting food trade. And so I think it too will probably add 100 million people to the ranks of the poor, the absolute poor. Still, we can see from this graph that we have experienced that we are still in the midst of a huge liberation. It's like the Exodus of the Bible, but much bigger. And I am just sure that Almighty God wants us to get with the program to help make it happen. On the left side of the graphic, you can see that the United States too has made some progress against poverty. We can do it here too. I mean, clearly, if Bangladesh can reduce poverty, so can the USA. But this graphic shows that we have reduced it. Now, most of the progress that we've made was actually made in about 10 years between in the late 60s and early 70s. I think the race riots of the late 60s kind of woke the nation up and made us want to reduce poverty. And we, in fact, reduced poverty in half in those years. Lyndon Johnson ran the Great Society programs. Richard Nixon, it was under his administration that the government expanded, created the modern food stamp program. Since about 1974, we really haven't made more progress, but on the other hand, we've defended against constant criticism. We've defended the safety nets that were set up back then, and we've maintained the lower level of poverty that we achieved back then. One reason why we haven't made much progress is because the wages for low-income workers have been pretty much stagnant that whole time, so they haven't been able to work their way out of out of poverty. What's surprising is what's happened after 2019. Because, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had these long lines of people at food banks, millions of people lost their job. We had every reason to think that we were going to see a huge and sustained surge in poverty. But in fact, we now know from census data that we have reduced hunger and poverty during the pandemic, despite the pandemic. Congress has, right away when the pandemic hit, Congress moved bipartisan legislation, massive legislation, to keep the economy going, to help families where somebody had lost a job. And it made a difference. And then in 2021, President Biden proposed the American Rescue Act. It passed in the spring. That also made a big difference for poor and hungry people. And who would have guessed, that poverty's come down? It just shows us again that God's made it possible for us to make progress against poverty. Now, to talk about what people of faith can do, I want to talk about my own experience at Bread for the World. I was president at Bread from 1991 to 2019. Bread for the World is a national movement of Christians of all stripes, mostly Christians, people who want to get our government to do its part to reduce hunger. About 1 million people take action with Bread for the World in a year. Maybe 5,000 people are really committed. But in every congressional district, there's at least one church, one leader activist who's pushing for the legislative changes that other Bread for the World members all over the country are pushing for. I've just seen that works over and over again. I've seen it work. Usually Bread for the World working with legislative advocacy networks in the churches, in other groups. It's got to be done in coalition, and it works. Now, I think our biggest win was actually the Jubilee debt relief campaign, and then what happened after that. In the late 1990s, Pope John Paul II and the Anglican bishops at the Lambeth Conference of 1998 both called on the world to make the millennium year, 2000, a Jubilee year for poor people all around the world. A lot of the poorest countries in the world were carrying impossible debts, and so they called on us to write down those debts so that those countries had a chance to take care of their people and achieve economic expansion. A group of activists in the UK organized the International Jubilee campaign, Jubilee campaigns in Africa and all across Europe and in the US. And then Bread for the World led the legislative campaign in the US that focused on actually getting the US government to support debt relief for low-income countries in Africa and also in Asia and Latin America. When we started, we had support from no politician, Democrat or Republican. It was just an idea, a religious idea. But it caught on. People in the churches really, it rung true for them. And activists across the country started to work. The one I want to tell you about really had an extraordinary experience, and that is Pat Pelham in Birmingham, Alabama. She goes for walks in the mornings and says her prayers then. And one morning, it was like Saul on the road to Damascus. She felt like God was telling her to help Africa. In the 1990s, almost all the news coming out of Africa was bad. And Pat felt called to do something about it. But she'd never been to Africa. She had little kids to take care of. Her husband's job was in Birmingham, but she decided to go to her minister, her pastor, and ask for ideas about how she should respond. You know, she didn't give up. And her minister knew about Bread for the World. He'd seen a flyer that the president of Bread for the World was going to be speaking at Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic Church across town. And so Pat and her friend Elaine Van Cleve came, they learned about Bread for the World, and then they went back to Independent Presbyterian Church. They organized a big hunger banquet, which was a way of educating people about hunger and what can we do about it, what can be done about it on a large scale, to reduce hunger on a large scale. They managed to get their member of Congress, Spencer Backus, to come. Spencer Backus is a conservative Republican from Birmingham, Alabama. But he's a good Southern Baptist, and he could see that this was good. This was of the Lord. So he became involved in Bread for the World a little bit, and then in 1999, maybe a year later, he was appointed the chair of the International Subcommittee of the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives. So if the United States government was going to be really supportive of debt relief for the world's poorest countries, Spencer Backus needed to be supportive. So Pat and Elaine and a couple other people from their church flew up to Washington at their own expense. They met with Spencer Backus. They talked. Elaine talked as a mother about wanting to help kids in Africa. It touched the heart of Spencer Backus, and he became an outstanding and very unlikely advocate for debt relief. He worked for it over the next couple years and beyond. At the end of 2020, when the appropriations for this passed, the White House held a signing ceremony. President Clinton looked at Spencer Backus in the front row, and he said, well, you're in the other party, but we would not be here today if it weren't for you, Spencer Backus. And I used my 2 minutes to talk about Pat Pelham. And people like Pat, Christian people like that all across the country, who had worked one by one with their own members of Congress in groups, going to see their members of Congress, writing to build support for a Jubilee for poor people around the world. It worked remarkably well. The implementation was really impressive, led by the World Bank and the IMF in the end. The most vivid impact was that many of the African countries used the money from debt relief to make elementary schools free of tuition. These are public schools, but families had to pay tuition to send their kids. So they couldn't send their kids, or they'd send the boys and not the girls. So because of debt relief, a whole generation of African girls learned how to read and write, add and subtract. More generally, debt relief helped to improve health, reduce child mortality. It contributed to economic growth in about half the countries of Africa. In some of those countries, they developed more accountable governments. So it was a really positive, big change in the world. And I don't think it would have happened if Pat Pelham had not been responsive to what she heard God telling her in her morning prayers. The debt relief win gave the church community momentum on this issue. And we got help from Bono. And also Bill Gates got engaged. He decided this was a good investment. And it turned out that George W. Bush was a good president for Africa. And then Barack Obama pretty much followed the policies, the types of policies that Bush was evolving. So we were able to win step by step in lots of specific ways. We were able to help win a quadrupling of poverty-focused U.S. foreign assistance, and improvements in the quality of assistance, improvements in the impact of assistance. So I know from my own experience that people of faith, if they take the time and effort to learn about big issues, to focus, we can change the U.S. government to some extent. And that is important for poor people across this country. It's important for poor people all over the world. Now, we all know that our country and the world right now are buffeted by a series of crises. And I think, to me, the most important thing is that our nation is almost evenly divided, at least in terms of the elected representatives, so that, and the two parties represent two very different directions. In that bill that passed in early 2021, included a provision of the new provision of the child tax credit. And from census data, the Census Bureau now has been collecting data on household welfare every couple of weeks during the pandemic. And so we know that almost as soon as that provision went into effect, the number of, or the percentage, the number of children in poverty in this country dropped by 30%. 30%, and it stayed at that lower level all through the year. But then that provision needed to be extended. And the bill that would have extended it came to the Senate floor in December, and it was voted down by one vote. All the Republicans voted against it. Senator Manchin voted against it. And you can see from the census data then that in January, all those kids went back into, those households went into poverty. So poverty is harsh on children. It also just causes tremendous emotional stress in those families. But all those children dropped back into poverty because we made because Congress made a decision that was, in my judgment, just wrong. I've worked in a bipartisan way all my life, but in 2021 and 2022 so far, the Republicans have voted as a bloc over and over again against things that are important to poor people, against things that are important to people of color. In a couple of instances, they've voted against measures that would have been good for democracy, just good for democracy. And then President Trump is still the most important, most influential leader in the Republican Party. And in my judgment, President Trump's personal morality, his policies, are almost completely antithetical to Christianity. So I'm scandalized that most white Christians voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and again 2020. You know, people have complicated reasons for making voting decisions, but it just is scandalous to me that most white Christians were moved to vote for Trump, both in 2016 and 2020. This Virginia theological course is going to be exploring how we can effectively connect our Christian faith to the politics of poverty. That's what these videos are going to be about too. God has made progress possible. we can help to make it happen. And our country and the world are desperately looking to people of faith to work actively and effectively for change.